Trigger warning. It was 10:23 p.m. on December 8th, and I had just stepped out of the shower. The steam from the hot water still clung to the mirror as I wiped it away, getting ready to collapse into bed. But, as always, there was one last thing to do: check my phone before calling it a night. I unlocked it and my screen lit up with a barrage of notifications. The group chat was usually quiet, just the occasional message here and there, but tonight, dozens of unread messages filled the screen. There were only 4 of us in the chat: Zeke, Morgan, Jack, and me. We were old college friends. Over the years, we'd stayed in touch, meeting up for drinks or the occasional weekend hangout. But it had been a while since we'd all been together. Curious, I scrolled up to see what had caused the sudden flurry of activity. The first message was from Zeke, of course. He'd sent a picture of a cabin, wooden, rustic, and nestled in the middle of a snow-covered clearing. The warm glow of lights in the windows and the curl of smoke rising from the chimney made it look inviting, cozy even. Along with the picture he wrote, "What do you guys think? $400 a night, split 4 ways, it's nothing. Should we plan a little getaway up north?" I stared at the image for a moment. The cabin did look nice, quaint, and honestly, it had been ages since I'd gotten away. Life had become routine. Work was a grind and everything else felt like it was on repeat. The idea of a snowy escape with old friends sounded like the perfect break. Morgan was the first to reply. "OMG, yes. Jack and I are in." He said it really was. He just couldn't get the film ready to move for printing. Jack, predictably, didn't have much to say. His reply came a few minutes later, likely after Morgan had convinced him, "Yeah, sounds good." Zeke, always one to tease, followed up with, "That's the spirit, Jack. Way to take charge." I smiled at that. Poor Jack. Then Zeke sent another message, this one directed at me. "Grace?" I asked, my thumb hovering over the screen. I glanced back at the picture of the cabin. It looked so peaceful, so inviting. I hadn't been on a trip in forever. Maybe this was just what I needed. After a moment's hesitation, I typed back, "Sure, I'm in." Zeke's reply came almost immediately. "Hell yeah, it's happening." Morgan followed up with, "This is going to be so fun. We'll figure out the dates tomorrow." Loaded question. I smiled to myself as I set my phone down on the nightstand and climbed into bed. The thought of the cabin stayed with me as I drifted off to sleep, the promise of a getaway with old friends lingering in my mind. Footnote: the next night, December 9th, my phone buzzed relentlessly, delivering half a dozen messages in the span of 30 seconds. I picked it up, already guessing who was responsible for the sudden barrage. Zeke had sent the first message. "Booked it, Deck 30th to Jan 8th. We're officially cabin-bound, people." Attached was an image of the booking confirmation. Morgan was, predictably, the first to respond. Her reply was a whirlwind of enthusiasm, expressed through an absurd combination of 7 emojis: a snowflake, a fire, a pine tree, a heart, a smiley face, a champagne bottle, and a party popper. I couldn't help but laugh and type back, calling off work in advance, looking forward to it. Zeke gave a thumbs up, and Jack, as usual, stayed quiet. December 29th, 8:16 p.m. My phone buzzed again, this time with a message from Zeke. "Hey, do you need a ride? I can pick you up tomorrow before we leave. It's just about a 20-minute drive." I'd been waiting for this text. My car had given up on me a few days earlier and was still in the shop, leaving me stranded. I quickly replied, "Yes, please. Thanks, man. I'll be ready." Zeke responded with a simple, "Cool. See you tomorrow." With that settled, I started getting my bags ready. Clothes, toiletries, a couple of books I probably wouldn't read but brought anyway, and some snacks for the road. Everything was packed and set by the door. All that was left was one more day of work. December 30th. By the time I got home from work, I was exhausted, but the excitement of the trip kept me moving. I double-checked my bags, grabbed my coat, and texted Zeke, "I'm ready whenever you are." Initiated the adventure. 15 minutes later, the rumble of Zeke's truck pulling into my driveway signaled his arrival. I stepped outside, shivering slightly in the cold, and waved as he rolled down the window. "Hey, Grace," he called out with a grin. "Ready for some cabin vibes?" "Definitely," I said, tossing my bags into the bed of his truck. I climbed into the passenger seat and we were off. The hum of the engine and the rhythmic thud of tires on asphalt quickly lulled me into a comfortable haze. I didn't even realize how tired I was until my eyelids started to droop. The last thing I remembered before falling asleep was Zeke humming along to some old rock song on the radio, the snow-covered landscape outside the window fading into a blur. When I woke up, Zeke's hand was on my shoulder, gently shaking me awake. I blinked, disoriented, and noticed the truck was parked in front of a small diner. "Hey," Zeke said, his voice cutting through my grogginess. "Morgan and Jack should be here in about 10 minutes. They wanted to meet up before we head up to the cabin." I nodded, shaking off the remnants of sleep, and climbed out of the truck. The cold air hit me like a slap to the face, making me instantly more alert. We walked into the diner together, Zeke leading the way as I trudged behind, still trying to gather my composure. Inside, the warm air and smell of frying bacon greeted us. A waitress guided us to a booth in the corner. I slid into my seat, ordered a small meal, just enough to tide me over, and leaned back, trying to shake off the chill. Zek raised an eyebrow. "Is that all you're ordering?" "Yeah, I'm not starving," I replied. "Come on, Grace, you know, none of us are great cooks. Might as well enjoy a decent meal now." I rolled my eyes, but added a side of pancakes to my order. 5 minutes later, Morgan and Jack arrived, spotting us easily in the corner. Morgan slid into the booth beside me without hesitation, leaving Jack and Zeke to squeeze into the other side. Jack looked mildly annoyed, but Zeke just grinned, adjusting to the cramped space. After finishing our meals, we headed back outside. The cold was sharper now, and the snow crunched beneath our boots as we climbed into our vehicles. Zek's truck led the way up the mountain, the road winding through thick forests dusted in white. About 10 minutes later, we arrived. For $400 a night, the cabin was a steal. The rustic exterior was charming, with wide wooden beams and a wraparound porch that overlooked the snowy landscape. Smoke from the chimney hinted at a fireplace, and the soft glow of the porch light made it feel inviting, despite the frigid air. I grabbed my bags from the back of Zeke's truck and headed toward the door. A small lockbox hung beside it, containing the key. "Zeke, what's the code for the key?" I yelled over my shoulder. 6,278, he shouted back from where he was unloading bags. My fingers were half frozen by the time I punched in the code and retrieved the key. The relief of stepping inside and feeling the warm air wash over me was almost euphoric. The first thing I did was turn on the heat to make sure the cabin stayed warm. Before long, everyone had shuffled inside, their arms full of bags and supplies. I ran upstairs, eager to claim a room, and chose the one farthest down the hall. It was cozy, with a window overlooking the snowy forest, and just enough space for a bed and a small dresser. Leaning over the banister that overlooked the living room, I called down to Zeke, who was still near the door. "Come on and get unpacked already." Zeke hesitantly did so and fell through the door to the top. He waved me off with a laugh, and I returned to my room to unpack my things. Once everyone had settled in, we gathered in the living room and broke out a game of Monopoly. It was fun, something I needed to help wind down. By the time we finished, it was late, and everyone was ready to crash. One by one, we retreated to our rooms, the cabin growing quiet as we drifted off to sleep. Here's a cleaned-up version of Part 4, keeping it concise and smooth. Night 2, December 31st. The cabin had been everything I needed, fun, relaxing, and a perfect escape from the grind of everyday life. But as it turned out, this was the last night things would feel normal. I had just finished dinner and was waiting for my turn to take a shower. Everyone had been arguing earlier about who should go first, so I volunteered to go last. It wasn't a big deal. I preferred a quiet shower anyway. "Grace, I'm out of the shower," Morgan's voice called from upstairs. He grabbed my towel and headed up, stepping into the bathroom. The air was thick and humid, the mirror fogged from the heat of everyone else's showers. I shut the door behind me, stripped off my clothes, and stepped into the warm water. The shower was everything I needed. I stayed in longer than I probably should have, letting the water soothe my muscles and steam away the stress of the day. By the time my fingers had pruned, I finally forced myself to get out, grabbing a towel to dry off. It wasn't until I was ready to head back to my room that I noticed something odd. My dirty clothes were gone. I'd taken off my tall, expressionless Polish rough suit and turned into a ragloin of Wimper's sister. At first I thought maybe I'd misplaced them, but as I looked around, a flicker of unease crept into my mind. My thoughts jumped to all sorts of irrational conclusions. Then I thought of the recalled patients I'd seen the week ago. I stepped out into the hallway, still clutching my towel, and nearly ran into Zeke. He was standing there with a small laundry basket in his hands. "You scared the shit out of me," I blurted, startled. "I thought someone stole my clothes." Zeke chuckled, though it sounded a little forced. "No, just keeping up on laundry." I stared at him, my heart still racing. "Maybe you could have waited until I was finished, asshole." His expression shifted. The easygoing demeanor he usually wore disappeared, replaced by something colder, more serious. "I was waiting," he said flatly, "but someone decided to take an hour in the shower. I want to go to bed, and I promised I'd do the laundry." I opened my mouth to respond, but nothing came out. His tone was sharp, and I felt a little embarrassed for snapping at him. "Fine," I muttered, brushing past him and heading to my room. Once inside, I closed the door and let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I checked the time. 11:15 p.m. Maybe I was a little hard on him, I thought, trying to shake off the lingering discomfort. I turned off the light and climbed into bed, ready to let the day end. Here's a cleaned-up version of Part 5, keeping the tension and flow intact. Night 3, January 1st. The day had started like any other. After breakfast, we bundled up in layers and decided to take on the ambitious challenge of building the biggest snowman we could. It was harder than it looked, but the effort was half the fun. Between snowball fights, laughter, and Morgan insisting on giving the snowman a fashionable scarf, the day flew by. By the time we got back inside, I was exhausted but looking forward to a hot shower. As usual, I took the last turn, leaving my clothes just outside the bathroom door before stepping into the steamy sanctuary. The water was soothing, washing away the chill of the day, and as always, I let my mind wander. I stayed in longer than I probably should have, lost in thought. But then something pulled me back to reality. I glanced up, and my heart stopped. In the ceiling above the shower was a small hole, no bigger than a quarter. At first, I thought maybe it was just a random imperfection in the wood, but then I saw it. An eye. Someone was watching me. A scream tore from my throat as I bolted out of the bathroom, barely managing to wrap a towel around myself. In my panic, I tripped over the pile of clothes I'd left outside the door, hitting the floor hard. Before I could gather myself, the others came running. Morgan and Jack rushed up the stairs, their faces etched with concern. Zeke appeared from his room, his expression unreadable. "Well, what happened?" Morgan asked, kneeling to help me up. Oh, I stuttered, still trying to catch my breath. "Morn," she said gently, guiding me toward my room. "We can talk about this later." Once inside, Morgan stayed with me while I dried off and got dressed. I could barely form a coherent thought, let alone speak, but eventually I managed to get the words out. Maybe I was a little hard on him, I thought, trying to shake off the lingering discomfort. I turned off the light and climbed into bed, ready to let the day end. Here's a cleaned-up version of Part 5, keeping the tension and flow intact. Night 3, January 1st. The day had started like any other. After breakfast, we bundled up in layers and decided to take on the ambitious challenge of building the biggest snowman we could. It was harder than it looked, but the effort was half the fun. Between snowball fights, laughter, and Morgan insisting on giving the snowman a fashionable scarf, the day flew by. By the time we got back inside, I was exhausted but looking forward to a hot shower. As usual, I took the last turn, leaving my clothes just outside the bathroom door before stepping into the steamy sanctuary. The water was soothing, washing away the chill of the day, and as always, I let my mind wander. I stayed in longer than I probably should have, lost in thought. But then something pulled me back to reality. I glanced up, and my heart stopped. In the ceiling above the shower was a small hole, no bigger than a quarter. At first, I thought maybe it was just a random imperfection in the wood, but then I saw it. An eye. Someone was watching me. A scream tore from my throat as I bolted out of the bathroom, barely managing to wrap a towel around myself. In my panic, I tripped over the pile of clothes I'd left outside the door, hitting the floor hard. Before I could gather myself, the others came running. Morgan and Jack rushed up the stairs, their faces etched with concern. Zeke appeared from his room, his expression unreadable. "What happened?" Morgan asked, kneeling to help me up. I stuttered, still trying to catch my breath. "Me this morning," she said gently, guiding me toward my room. "We can talk about this later." Once inside, Morgan stayed with me while I dried off and got dressed. I could barely form a coherent thought, let alone speak, but eventually I managed to get the words out. "Well, there was a hole in the ceiling of the shower," I stammered, my voice trembling. "I swear I saw an eye looking at me." Morgan's face darkened, but she kept her voice calm. "I believe you," she said, placing a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "We'll get to the bottom of this." I wanted to leave. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to get out of that cabin, but I didn't have a ride home. I was stuck. Later, we all gathered in the living room. Morgan explained what had happened, her tone serious as she recounted my story. I stayed silent, my hands clenched into fists as I stared at the floor. Morgan had taken a picture of the hole in the shower, and when she showed it to us, we saw that it was now covered by something. The sight sent a fresh wave of unease through me. For a long time, no one said anything. The room was heavy with tension, the crackling fire the only sound. But slowly, doubt began to creep into the conversation. "As you ran out of there pretty quick," Zeke said, his voice calm but firm. "Are you sure you didn't just imagine it?" Jack nodded, though he looked uncomfortable. "Yeah, I mean, it was just a quick peek, right? It could have been anything." Morgan shot them both a glare but didn't argue. I could see the doubt creeping into her expression too. I wanted to fight back, to insist that I wasn't imagining things, but I didn't. Maybe I was just too tired. Maybe I didn't want to believe what I'd seen either. The room eventually fell quiet, and the conversation shifted to lighter topics. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, even as I forced myself to smile and nod along. Night 4, January 2nd. The day dragged on in a haze of unease. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, and every creak of the cabin made my skin crawl. We'd all agreed no one would step foot in the upstairs bathroom again, opting for the cramped and less appealing downstairs one. It wasn't ideal, but it felt safer somehow. I spent most of the day curled up in the living room, trying to distract myself with games or small talk, but my mind kept circling back to the night before. The others tried to lighten the mood, but I could see the tension in their faces too. By nightfall, I had loosened up a bit. The fire was warm, and the company helped dull the edge of my fear. But as bedtime approached, the anxiety crept back in. When I got to my room, I turned on every light and started searching. I wasn't going to let myself sleep without making sure there were no more surprises. It didn't take long. Right above my bed there was another hole, about the size of a quarter. It had been covered up, but not well enough to hide the faint outline. My heart pounded in my chest as I bolted out of the room. I ran down the hall and started knocking frantically on Morgan's door. She opened it, looking startled. "What's wrong?" "Another hole," I said breathlessly, "above my bed." Morgan didn't hesitate. She grabbed her phone and followed me back to my room. Soon, all four of us were crowded in there, staring up at the ceiling. Zeke held a flashlight, illuminating the faintly covered hole. "The listing never mentioned an attic," Zeke said, his voice calm but thoughtful. "But it did say there's a basement." "Basement?" Morgan asked, frowning. Zeke nodded. "I looked last night. I couldn't find an entrance. It must be hidden somewhere." His words didn't comfort me. If anything, they made my skin crawl. I opened my mouth, ready to say I wanted to leave, but Morgan cut me off. "Grace, you can sleep with me tonight," she said, her voice firm but kind. I nodded, relieved for the moment, but unable to shake the feeling that this wasn't over. As we all filed out of the room, I glanced back at the hole one last time. It felt like it was staring back at me. Got it. Here's a cleaner, slightly expanded version of the first part of Part 7 to help build tension and make the scene feel more natural. Night 6, January 4th. The day had been eerily quiet. After everything that had happened, the absence of tension felt almost unnatural. Jack and Morgan had gone out to grab supplies for the final 2 days, leaving me alone with Zeke. I sat on the couch, trying to distract myself with the TV, but it felt like my mind was working overtime. The unease gnawed at me, never quite letting go. Zeke was in the kitchen, busy making coffee. The quiet buzz of his phone on the coffee table caught my attention. Without thinking, I reached over to check the time, but my thumb accidentally swiped left. The camera app opened. That's when I saw it. In the corner of the screen, the preview of the last picture taken, my picture, was displayed. I froze. It was a shot of me, lying in bed. The angle, the lighting, the unmistakable perspective, it had been taken through the hole above my bed. A cold wave of dread washed over me. My stomach dropped, and my heart pounded so loudly I thought Zeke might hear it. My body went stiff, but I forced myself to stay calm, carefully placing the phone back on the table. I couldn't let him know I'd seen it, not yet. The SS guys responded, and the intake group left the flat room. I grabbed my own phone, my fingers shaking as I quickly created a group chat with Jack and Morgan. My mind raced as I typed a single message, "SOS, it's Zeke." I set my phone to silent, praying they'd see it in time. "Coffee's ready," Zeke called from the kitchen, his voice casual, too calm. I turned around, forcing a smile as he approached with 2 steaming mugs. "Thanks," I said, taking the cup from him. I wanted to scream, to run, but I knew that would only make things worse. The best plan was to play along. I took a sip, pretending to relax, but every fiber of my being was on high alert. "Oh, I think I left my phone in Morgan's room. Be right back." I stood up, my legs feeling like jelly beneath me. I moved quickly but quietly, heading upstairs. Once I was out of sight, I peeked over the banister. Zeke was back in the living room, his eyes glued to the TV, unaware of my movements. I slipped into his room. He needed to confirm it was him. I started with his bag, my hands trembling as I dug through it. My stomach churned when I found them. My panties from the second night, hidden deep inside, buried among his things. I snapped a picture with my phone, my fingers shaking as I fought back the rising nausea. The room felt like it was closing in on me, and I could barely breathe. Then my eyes landed on the closet. There, tucked away behind a stack of clothes, I noticed something. A small hatch, almost imperceptible unless you were looking for it. My heart skipped a beat. I reached for it, my hands slick with sweat, and pulled it open just a crack. A faint, musty smell hit me, but I didn't have time to investigate. The briefest glimpse inside revealed nothing more than shadows and an old, forgotten toolkit. But I didn't need to see more. I knew what it meant. This was where he had been watching me. Before I could process the implications, my head began to spin. My vision blurred and my limbs grew heavy. I staggered backward, my knees buckling beneath me, but just before I collapsed, I heard Zeke's voice from the doorway. "That coffee hit you, huh?" I turned to see him standing there, leaning against the doorframe, his expression a mixture of amusement and something darker. He didn't look surprised. He'd been waiting for this moment. "So, I guess you figured it out," he said, stepping closer, his voice low and calm. "Shame it's at the expense of your life." I tried to move, tried to run, but my body wouldn't respond. The darkness took over and everything went black. When I woke up, my head was throbbing and my mouth was dry. Panic surged through me as I realized I couldn't move. My wrists were tied tightly to the bed frame and a gag was shoved into my mouth, choking off any sound I tried to make. I struggled against the restraints, my mind racing with thoughts of what might have happened while I was unconscious. The fear of not knowing what he'd done to me was almost worse than the pain. Zeke was sitting nearby, casually zipping up his bag. The sight of him was almost surreal. He looked so calm, so detached, as though what was happening wasn't a big deal. He turned to me with a soft, almost affectionate smile, as if we were having some quiet, intimate conversation. "Grace," he said, his voice surprisingly tender. "I loved you. I really did. But you were too stupid to see that." I screamed against the gag, tears streaming down my face. My chest ached with the effort, and I thrashed against the ropes, my body desperate to break free. "I hate to do this to you," he continued, his voice low, almost regretful. "But I'm not going to get another chance." He climbed onto the bed, his weight pressing down on me. I froze, my body going stiff with terror. His hands brushed against my skin, and I wanted to scream, to fight, but I couldn't. The restraints were too tight, and my limbs felt like they were made of lead. "You remember that night we got drunk?" he asked, his voice dropping to a whisper, like we were sharing a secret. "You lifted your shirt for me. This isn't so different, is it?" I shook my head violently, my heart racing in my chest. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All I could feel was his presence closing in on me, suffocating me. "You're beautiful, you know that," he whispered, his hands moving to the hem of my shirt. "We won't be needing this." His fingers brushed against the fabric and I shuddered, my body reacting against him even though I couldn't move. I could feel his breath on my neck, his hands too close, and I knew what was coming. I couldn't stop it. Just as his hand reached under my shirt, I saw movement from the corner of my eye. Jack and Morgan. Jack was holding the heavy prop gun from the fireplace mantel. He swung it with all his strength, hitting Zeke square in the back of the head. The impact was sickening, and Zeke collapsed onto the bed, unconscious before he even hit the mattress. Morgan was there in an instant, her hands shaking as she worked to untie me. She fumbled with the ropes, but within moments I was free. She ripped the gag from my mouth, and I gasped for air, my throat raw from the pressure. "We need to go," Jack said urgently, his voice tight with fear. I nodded, barely able to think, as they helped me out of the cabin and into their car. I could barely process what had just happened. My mind was still reeling from the terror, the helplessness. I kept seeing Zeke's face, his twisted smile, his hands on me. It was like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. The drive to the authorities was a blur. Between sobs, I told them everything, about the hole, the pictures, the attic, the things Zeke had said. I showed them the evidence on my phone, desperate for them to believe me. But I knew, deep down, that it might be too late. By the time we reached the cabin, Zeke was gone. A manhunt is still underway, but deep down, I doubt they'll find him. Zeke is smart, too smart. He knows how to disappear. Now, days later, under the protection of the authorities, I still can't shake the feeling of being watched. Every creak, every shadow, every fleeting sound sends a chill down my spine, because I know he's still out there. January 16th. I thought I had seen the last of Zeke, but today, while I was cooking dinner, I heard the doorbell ring. When I opened the door, there was no one in sight. I scanned the yard, expecting to see a group of kids running off, but all I saw was a faint snow trail leading toward the road. At my feet, there was a post-it note. The corner was torn, and it had been crumpled slightly. The letters were jagged, almost unrecognizable, and the ink, no, the red stain, was unmistakably blood. It read, "I'm sorry, Grace, I love you." I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The world seemed to tilt as I backed inside, slamming the door shut behind me. My hands were shaking as I dialed the cops, but I already knew this was far from over. Now, as I write this in May of 2015, nothing has come up, no sign of him, no answers. I don't know where that monster is, but I know one thing for sure. Until they find him, dead or alive, I don't think I'll ever be able to sleep without that lingering feeling, the feeling that he's still out there, watching, waiting.